Hey guys, so today we're going to go through inverse proportion as part of rates and ratios. So the prior knowledge that you should know before this is you should know the steps and how to do direct proportion, and you should know how to use equations. The reason why you should know direct proportion is because obviously it's linked to inverse proportion, it's the opposite of it, but also because the steps are the same. So if you're comfortable with the steps of direct proportion, inverse proportion will be very easy for you. Now, the aim of this video is for you to be able to find the universal formula and the unknowns for any inverse or indirect proportion. Now, why did I say inverse or indirect? Because they're the same thing. Some textbooks will call it inverse, some will call it indirect. Some worksheets will call it inverse, and some worksheets will call it indirect, but they are the same thing. Now, how does indirect or inverse proportion work? Well, it's the opposite of direct proportion. So, we can theoretically say if two quantities are inverse proportion, then as one quantity increases, the other decreases. This means that we would expect it to have a negative gradient for that graph, and it would create a curve called a hyperbola. Now, a hyperbola is a graph that you'll become a lot more familiar with as you do graphing later on. Let's have a look at the steps for inverse proportion. Well, as you can see, the steps for inverse proportion are exactly the same as direct proportion, except for step 1 and 2. The difference in step 1 and 2 is that direct proportion, it says, well, let's go through the steps first and then we'll see the difference. Step 1, write the inverse statement where x is proportionate to 1 over y. Now this is where it's different. Direct proportion has x fish symbol or proportionate symbol y, while inverse has x fish symbol 1 over y. That's where the difference comes. Step 2, replace proportional symbol 1 over with equals k over. So that fish symbol and 1 is replaced with equals k. Just like direct proportion, except now we have a fraction on the other side. Step 3, sub in the values for the variables from the question. The question will give you values for x and y, and it will give you what you need to sub in. So you just sub them in. Just like direct proportion, we find the value of the constant by using equations, by getting k by itself. Once we've gotten k by itself, then we do step 5, which is we write our universal formula. Now, the reason I call it a universal formula is because it universally stays the same for any unknowns for that scenario, for that given scenario. And you'll understand what that means when we go through the examples later. And as we just stated, then we can use that universal formula to find any unknowns. Write those steps down because I'm going to link them to the examples. Okay, let's jump into the examples. Let's look at example 1. Example 1 says that x is inversely proportionate to y. So, step number 1 is to write my inverse proportion statement. X, proportional symbol, 1 over y, because x is inversely proportional to y. Step number 2 is to replace the fish symbol and 1 with equals k. And you can see I've done that there. Now, step number 3 was to sub in whatever you know from the equation for x and y. Does that give it to me? Yes, it does. When x equals 20, y equals 10. So we just sub those in there. So x equals 20, y equals 10, I sub them in. The next step is to get k by itself by using equations. So this is k over 10. So the opposite of k divided by 10 is to multiply by 10. So I multiply both sides by 10. And I get k equals 20 times 10, which is 200. Now that I have that 200, now I can then find my universal formula because I have my k. So that is x equals 200 over y. Very simple. That's my second last step. When I have my universal formula, if you remember and you go back to the steps, you can then find any unknown. Our unknown in the next part, in part B, says, when x equals 5, find the value of y. So when x equals 5, the 5 goes there in the universal formula. So I'll put that there. Now, simple equations, it's a one-step equation. It's a multi-step, but really we can do it in one step. When the pronumeral is down the bottom of a fraction, there is a shortcut, and that shortcut is that you swap the pronumeral with whatever is on the other side of the equals, if there's a single value there. So I can swap the 5 and the y. There is a longer way to do it, and that's correct as well. This is a shortcut, it's easy, and it works every time. So why not use it? So we just swap the 5 and the y. We only do that when the pronumeral is down the bottom though. So now that we swapped them, we have y equals 200 over 5. And 200 divided by 5 is 40. Let's look at the next part, part C. Another unknown, but we're using the same scenario, so we can use the same universal formula. It says, when y equals 80, find the value of x. So x is unknown now, and y is 80. So I just sub the 80 where the y is. And that's quite simple. 200 divided by 80 is 2.5. So when y is 80, x is 2.5. And you can find any unknown variable by using the universal formula as long as it's linked to the same scenario. Let's go on to the last example. I'll give you a second to read it and understand it because it's a word problem. So it states that 4 boys can clear a field in 3 hours. So there's a field. To clear it, 4 boys will take 3 hours. How long would it take 10 boys? So what we need to find out is when boys is 10, how many hours is that going to take? So we know that time is inversely proportional to the number of people, because as one goes up, the other one's going to go down. Okay, so as the number of people goes up, the time's going to go down, or vice versa. So we'll put boys as B and time as H. Now time is inversely proportionate to boys, so we write it as proportional 1 over B, replace the fish symbol 1 with equals K, sub in the values we know from the question. We know the time is 3 hours for 4 boys. Use equations to get K by itself. So it's going to be times 4 times 4. So now K is going to be 3 times 4, which is 12. Write my universal formula. Time equals 12 over boys. Then we sub in 10 boys because that's what the question is asking. How long would it take 10 boys? 12 divided by 10 is 1.2 hours. Now, how do I get that to hours and minutes? Well, on your calculators, you should have a degree, minute, and second button. It either looks like that or DMS. If you click that, after you have 1.2 on the screen, it'll convert it to hours and minutes, and you can round off wherever required. Hopefully, those examples gave you a better understanding of the steps for inverse proportion. I have a few questions here. Pause the video, try the questions, and then come back for the recommended answers. Okay, there's the recommended answers. Hopefully you got them right. Mark them off. If you didn't, go watch the video again. Till next time, take care, guys.